Welcome to the France 24 debate. Tonight, Europe's fight against terrorism. After Paris and now Copenhagen, we're going to be having a look this evening at how Europe can combat violent extremism within its midst without losing sight of the values and freedoms for which it stands. Also, the question of rising anti-Semitism, even as the continent remembers the liberation of Auschwitz and the end of the Second World War. Both the attacks in Paris and those of Copenhagen and the desecration over the weekend of a Jewish cemetery in France have served as reminders of the rise of anti-Semitism 70 years on. We're going to talk about all those issues as Europe confronts these problems this evening with Alexandre DEL VALLE, who's a professor of political science and geopolitics here in Paris, also author of The Syrian Chaos. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. With me as well here in the studio is Michael KIRTLEY, who's a producer of the World Memory Project. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. We're also joined this evening by satellite from Brussels by Ricardo Baretzky, who's the president of the European Centre for Information Policy and Security. Good evening to you. Thank you for being with us. We're also joined tonight by Skype from St. Louis by John Bowen, professor in the United States and an author of a number of works, including European States and their Muslim citizens, and Can Islam be French? Thank you very much indeed to all of you for being with us. First of all, let's have a listen to what the Danish Prime Minister had to say today in the wake of Saturday's attacks.
The Danish democracy is strong. The Danish nation is strong. And we will not accept any attempt to threaten or intimidate our liberties and our rights. And I want to underline that this is not a conflict between Islam and the West. This is not a conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims. This is a conflict between the core values of our society and violent extremists. Collectively and united, we will remain.
Michael KIRTLEY, listening to the Danish Prime Minister, one is reminded of the sense of shock here in Paris of last month's attacks. European countries are waking up to something they hadn't known before, these sorts of shocking attacks, which make them feel that as a society they are under threat.
And you're right, it does feel very eerily similar to the atmosphere here in Paris after the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January. And what I noticed is here we are describing this as an attack on our core values. That's what the Prime Minister said. And one has to ask, is it our definition that it's an attack on the core values, or is it somebody else's deciding they're going to attack the core values, or is it reactive? For me, this is part of the whole issue and the whole problem of how you face the rise of extremism. The first question is motivation. The motivation of the people who are attacking. We're deciding for them why they're doing something, and the motivation in our reactions. Because I think that right now we're in a position where by deciding what the motivations are of others because of targets that are chosen, we end up in a loop, I think, that creates a kind of a paranoia about what this meaning is. Rather than simply saying we're dealing with scoundrels, we're dealing with thugs, we're dealing with criminals who are attacking certain aspects. Now, that's very different when they're attacking specific religious symbols.
But on that question of the attack, for instance, on freedom of speech, and it was one of the things I think that the Danish Prime Minister was alluding to there, before we move on to the attack on the synagogue in Copenhagen, one of the targets on Saturday, and a reminder very specifically of what happened here in France, was a free speech meeting. One cartoonist has now gone into hiding. He believes that he may have been the target of that attack. That is what the Danish Prime Minister is referring to when she talks about those core values that are under attack. And I wonder whether you agree with that perhaps by
yes and no.
Are we elevating these attacks into more than they really are?
I think she's right when she says that it's not an opposition between the West and Islam. But when she says it's coming from violent terrorism, it's not clear. In geopolitics, perhaps we're wrong, but our method in geopolitics is always defining the enemy and the threat. The threat is not nothing, it's not a black hole. And those guys, even though they are not good Muslims, of course, yes, for someone, of course not for another one, but they are killing on the behalf, in the name of an ideology rooted into not Muslim world, but into a certain school of Islam. It doesn't come from Buddhism. They are, even though they are not good Muslims, they are sure they are implementing the real Islam coming from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is a state that is a good ally of the West. And it's not a non-existing country. It's the most important Islamic country that is hosting the holy places of Islam with the pilgrimage of Lamech and Medina. And many Salafist jihadist groups not only are financed by Saudi Arabia emirs and imams, but also this hatred is taught from this country. Many settlers, many imam, many evangelists, Islamist evangelists are expressing their hatred, and they are extending their hatred in the West, and freely, with no prohibition. The West is accepting that many Muslims coming from Saudi Arabia, fanatics, they are fanatizing many people against Jewish. Even some of my students, I am finishing, some of my students, good guys, sometimes they explain to me that Jewish are a problem for the world, and they are given this idea by imams in France, and those imams are not arrested. And they, if you are anti-Semitic and you are in the name of Nazism, you are immediately arrested. Is very good. But if you are anti-Semitic and you express your thinking in the name of Islam, you are not always arrested.
I'd like to put that question to John Bowen and bring you in, sir. We're told increasingly that we need to understand the threat from Islamist terrorists in terms of an ideology rather than a religion. In fact, the French Prime Minister used the term Islamofascism for the first time publicly today. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not sure what Islamofascism means. I get the general idea. I'm not sure, just going back to the previous comment, that the people, and it's a fairly small number, who have engaged in terrorism on European soil have been inspired particularly by their deep knowledge of the Hanbali madhab in Saudi Arabia, or the Wahhabi version. Indeed, many of the terrorists who caused great damage and death in Britain came out of a South Asian background, and we know that there are very violent Islamic terrorists in Pakistan. Furthermore, yeah, they're not Buddhists, but there are Buddhists killing Muslims in parts of Southeast Asia. And of course, it wasn't that long ago that Anders Behring Breivik was killing people in his country in the name of Christianity, his understanding of Christianity, the need to keep Muslims out. So radicals can inspire themselves. Let's not say radicals. Thugs, crooks, terrorists can be inspired by all sorts of ideologies. What happens is that they come to a point where they're placing their cause, their ideology over human life, and that's what we have to fight against, is that notion. The second point,
please, my apologies. Do carry on.
Yeah. Second point would be, and we may all be in agreement here, is that we have to do much more to replace the sorts of rabid anti-Semitic, anti-European preaching that the previous speaker was discussing, and I agree with him that has to be dealt with something else. We have a saying in the U.S., you can't fight something with nothing. So the something else has got to be other sorts of Islamic scholars, imams, da'i, preachers, who are given the means and for once salaried to go into prisons and to de-radicalize, to present another version of Islam. We can't just say, oh, it's Islam, isn't that terrible? Then what do we do? But what we have to do is present alternative understandings of Islam in those very places where people are being radicalized.
I'd like to bring in now Ricardo Baretzky of the European Centre for Information Policy and Security. One of the difficulties in all this is that it's been very hard for Europe to speak about these issues. We saw it in Paris immediately after the attacks. Marine Le Pen and her party came out very quickly to say that we needed to be able to talk about radical Islam in more obvious, flagrant terms than we had been so far, curbed, she was suggesting, by political correctness. Do we have a difficulty in Europe of looking at the problem of radical Islam?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we have to understand about using the word radical Islam. Everybody talks about the new fashion of radical Islam and radicalization that's taking place in terrorist movements. But from a security point of view, we have to look at things a little bit different. we have to define first where's the problems coming from. And where's the origin of these problems? What is the motives behind the attacks? And are they indeed really terrorist attacks in the first place? There's a whole range of issues surrounding that should be debated, but at the same time, solutions need to be founded for these problems. In essence, everybody have an concept of an idea of radicalization, but in principle, the terrorist perception has a complete different aspect in its motive. You must understand, terrorist organizations is focusing on strategically breaking down a government or an infrastructure. They're targeting specifically the parts of national state security instead of policing services. So it just coming to a definition of the present situation could be dangerous, in my opinion.
One of the difficulties that Ricardo touched on there, Michael, is that the threat is various. The types of attacks are various. We've seen over the course of the last few months, and a number of you have alluded to it already so far, different profiles, different types of attacks, different motivations. We're talking about a number of different people. Europe feels increasingly under threat, but it isn't under threat from any single organization.
Well, I think that you can say that it's definitely under threat from the perception that it comes from a single organization. I think that we have to ask ourselves at different points, who is the enemy? And I feel that part of the enemy here is our reaction. If today we have, and I kind of disagree there, I think that there is a message that's coming out of the Middle East, specifically out of Al-Qaeda and out of ISIS, that I think it's a relatively clear message to the Western world. It may not be so clear inside the Middle East, but is definitely clear to the Western world, and that message is twofold. It is, we are strong, therefore join us. And number two, we don't like certain elements of your society, therefore we will attack them. Okay, to me, that seems to be a relatively clear message. And I think that in terms of finding a counter message to that, we have to figure out what is clear that we want to present. And I think here is where the whole European paradigm and the media competing for information and the decision about what to do about all this it's a disservice. To us, to me, it serves as a disservice because we are thinking in terms of, not in terms of civilization. Even today we've heard Western civilization. What about the civilization that's in the Arab world that's also under attack? What about the civilization that's not even Arab or European that also feels under attack from this kind of terrorism? So I think that defining the enemy is simplistic, but it's not so much about defining what the enemy means to itself. I think what's really important is what is the enemy expressing to us? Now, along those lines, we have also the question of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not purely a Muslim thing. And anybody who tries to say that it is creating problems in terms of racism and in terms of reaction, in terms of solution. Today, if we're going to talk about terrorism against the Jewish community, of course, the last couple of months, we've seen terrorism, and in the past, we've seen terrorism propagated by certain people of Muslim faith. But we've also seen much terrorism against Jews, both recently and historically, that were not perpetrated by Muslims.
On that precise point, Alexander, the point about the anti-Semitism that we're talking about, this particular strand of what we've seen over the course of the last few days and months in Europe, is that the anti-Semitism expressed by radical Muslims sort of dovetails and meets and finds resonance with anti-Semitism that we're hearing about from other quarters entirely.
Perhaps it's why I wrote many years ago, I wrote a book on Islamic totalitarianism, and I did not accept fascist, Islamofascism, but more totalitarianism, because this Islamic totalitarianism is green. It seems to be green, the color of Islam, but in reality, inside it's brown. It's recycling the old Nazi ideology. But it doesn't mean that it is seducing many Nazi-born in Europe. It's the new form of Nazism, of totalitarianism, and Jewish are the center of the target. I think it's this third totalitarianism is using some aspects of the Marxism and also some aspect of Nazism, fight of classes and fight of races, of religions and civilizations. It's why it's very dangerous. For instance, we can mention David Mamet. David Mamet was a very important Nazi thinker. He converted to Islam and he joined Al-Qaeda in 2005. He was accepted by Al-Qaeda because he said, like Carlos came from the left wing. It was a leftist pro-Palestinian fighter. And also he converted to Islam. Both a Nazi and a former Marxist pro-Palestinian fighter, they said the Islamic totalitarianism is the new way to fight Jewish capitalism, democracies, and freedom of speech. And they are proud of it.
And we're going to stop there for a minute and have a quick break, but we'll be right back with the second part of tonight's debate. Do stay with us.